Richard Smallwood's funeral plans are now confirmed, and the gospel world is paying close attention. Because Richard Smallwood was not just a singer and he was not just a famous name. For decades, his music became a core part of worship services, choir performances, and spiritual moments for millions of people. His compositions were sung during celebrations, during loss, and during the hardest seasons of life. So when news of his passing broke, the reaction was immediate, emotional, and widespread. And as tributes poured in from all over the world, one question started rising quietly but consistently. How would the final farewell for Richard Smallwood be handled? Where would the service take place? Would it be public or private? And who would be allowed to attend? Today, we will break down everything that is confirmed so far about Richard Smallwood's funeral, the guest list expectations, the schedule, the location, and why the family chose to keep certain details private. Richard Smallwood passed away on December 30th, 2025. He was 77 years old. According to statements released by his family, he died following complications related to kidney failure. The family described his passing as peaceful with loved ones by his side. The announcement triggered a powerful wave of reactions from the gospel community. Gospel musicians, church leaders, choir directors, educators, and longtime fans shared tributes and memories, reflecting on what Smallwood's music meant to them personally. But something else was happening at the same time. Even as the public reaction grew, details surrounding his funeral were limited. In the first days after the announcement, there were no full schedules released, no major media briefings, and no public list of celebrity guests. And according to those close to the situation, that silence was not accidental. It was intentional. People familiar with Smallwood's life and values understood that he deserved reflection before ceremony. His story was never built on noise or headlines. It was built on devotion, discipline, and purpose. And the way his funeral plans were handled seems to reflect that same mindset. To understand why Richard Smallwood's funeral has drawn so much attention, it helps to look at who he was beyond the stage. Richard Smallwood was not only a composer, pianist, and gospel artist. He was also a teacher, mentor, and spiritual guide to many within the gospel world. His musical style blended classical training with deep gospel tradition, creating compositions that were technically rich and emotionally powerful. His songs were not written for trends. They were written for worship. And that is why, even years after release, pieces like Total Praise, I Love the Lord, and The Center of My Joy are still performed in churches around the world. For many believers, Richard Smallwood's music did not feel like background sound. It felt like a language of faith. His groups, including the Richard Smallwood Singers and later Vision, were known not only for their sound but also for precision, integrity, and discipline. People who followed his career often described his work as excellence with purpose, and many of today's gospel musicians credit him as one of their biggest influences. And his impact did not stay limited to church audiences alone. When Whitney Houston recorded I Love the Lord for The Preacher's Wife soundtrack, Smallwood's music reached mainstream listeners around the world. That moment introduced his writing to people who may never have attended a gospel choir rehearsal or a church service, but still connected deeply with the emotion and power behind his composition. That crossover moment proved something important. Gospel music, when written with depth and structure, could reach anyone. And Richard Smallwood became one of the strongest examples of that. After his passing, tributes continued to grow. Choir directors spoke about his uncompromising musical standards. Musicians remembered his insistence on preparation and excellence. Worship leaders reflected on how his music taught them that artistry and faith were not opposites, they were partners. And this is where the public attention shifted again. Because after the first wave of grief and tributes, the focus started moving toward the final farewell. Fans wanted to know how his life would be honored publicly. Would the service be open to the public? Would there be musical tributes? Would gospel leaders and major voices gather in one place to say goodbye? At this stage, it became clear that the family was approaching every decision carefully. Instead of rushing to release details immediately, they focused first on mourning privately. People close to the situation understood that anything done publicly would need to reflect Smallwood's values. That approach matched the way he lived. Richard Smallwood was known for prioritizing purpose over spectacle. And now, the format chosen for his farewell has confirmed that same spirit. Rather than holding a traditional funeral centered only on mourning, the family planned something different. A celebration of life. And that distinction matters. A celebration of life does not ignore grief, but it highlights gratitude, reflection, and the impact of the person being honored. For someone whose music consistently pointed people toward hope and strength, this format feels aligned with his legacy. As anticipation continued, more questions started circulating, especially around the guest list. And while no official guest list has been released publicly, there has been widespread expectation that the service will draw major figures in gospel music. Not for attention, not for headlines, but for respect. Many choir directors, composers, pastors, vocalists, and worship leaders who grew up on Smallwood's music are expected to be present. For many of them, Smallwood was more than an artist. He was a mentor, either directly or through his work. His influence shaped rehearsal rooms, church music departments, and worship services across denominations. At the same time, the family made one thing clear through the way the funeral planning was handled. This farewell would not be turned into a media event. Yes, public participation would be allowed, but the tone would remain dignified, organized, and reverent. This balance between openness and restraint is part of why people are watching this so closely. Because Richard Smallwood's funeral is not a typical celebrity farewell. The interest surrounding it is not driven by gossip or shock value. It is driven by connection. People feel personally tied to his music. Even those who never met him often feel like they know him because his compositions were present in some of their most meaningful life moments. And that is why saying goodbye feels personal for so many. Throughout his career, Richard Smallwood emphasized preparation, discipline, and humility. He often spoke about music as ministry, not performance. And the final farewell being planned in a careful and intentional way shows that his philosophy is still shaping how he is being honored. Now, after weeks of reflection and anticipation, the confirmed funeral details have finally been shared respectfully. The public celebration of life for Richard Smallwood will take place on Saturday, January 24, 2026. The location is First Baptist Church of Glenarden International in Upper Marlboro, Maryland. The service is scheduled to begin at 12:00 noon Eastern Time. And to accommodate attendees, doors will open to the public at 9:30 a.m. Funeral arrangements have been entrusted to Precious Memories Funeral Home. This service is expected to bring together members of the gospel community, worshipers, musicians, and admirers from different places, all coming together for one purpose: to honor a life devoted to faith and musical excellence. While specific musical participants have not been publicly listed, it is widely expected that the service will include carefully selected performances and tributes that reflect Smallwood's legacy. And that is an important detail. Because when a man's life is defined by music, the final farewell is not complete without the sound that defined him. But there is another part of this story that is also important, especially when it comes to the guest list. The family has chosen to keep burial details private. That moment will be reserved for close relatives and loved ones only. This decision shows the balance the family has maintained throughout the entire process. They are allowing public remembrance and public honor. But they are also protecting intimate family moments from becoming public spectacle. This is often how high-respect farewells are handled, especially for a figure whose life was rooted in faith and humility rather than public attention. So what does all of this tell us? It tells us that Richard Smallwood's farewell will not be defined by celebrity attendance or media coverage. It will be defined by the collective gratitude of those whose lives he touched. Because even after the service ends, his music will not end. Choirs will continue rehearsing his compositions. Worshippers will continue finding comfort in his words and melodies. New generations will still discover total praise and understand why it became timeless. And gospel musicians will still study the structure of his arrangements, the discipline behind his sound, and the spiritual intention behind his writing.